She was making tea when my phone buzzed. I remember that detail because it was the kind of ordinary Tuesday morning that you don't expect to remember. The kettle was whistling. The radio was low, some CBC morning program about the weather in Ottawa. My wife was standing at the counter in her blue cardigan, the one she wore on weekends when she wasn't going anywhere. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my reading glasses on, going through some invoices from the previous week. Retired men still find ways to stay busy, even when there's nothing urgent left to prove. Her name was Sandra. We had been married for 22 years. I set down my coffee and looked at my phone. The message was from my former colleague at the firm, a man named Roy, a fraud examiner I had worked with for nearly 15 years before we both retired. Roy was sharper than most people gave him credit for. He noticed things. It was what made him good at the job, and what made him occasionally exhausting at dinner parties. The message said, "Is that Sandra with you right now?" I looked up from the table. She had her back to me, pouring the hot water slowly. I typed back, "Yes. Why?" His reply came in under 30 seconds. "I'm standing in the lobby of the Fairmont Chateau Laurier. I just watched a woman who looks exactly like Sandra walk through the front doors with a man I don't recognize. She's checking in. I took a photo. Tell me I'm wrong." The photo came through a moment later. It was blurry at the edges. Roy never had steady hands, even back in the day. But the woman in the frame was wearing a gray wool coat with a particular kind of collar, a mandarin collar. It was distinctive. Sandra owned a coat like that. I had bought it for her 3 Christmases ago from a shop on Spark Street. She had worn it to her sister's birthday dinner in November. I put the phone face down on the table. Sandra turned around with 2 cups of tea and set one in front of me. She smiled the way she always smiled, a little tired, a little warm. The smile of someone who had been married long enough to be comfortable in silence. She sat down across from me and picked up the newspaper she had left folded beside the fruit bowl. I watched her. I had spent 31 years as a forensic document examiner. Not the glamorous kind you see in television programs, no crime scenes, no trench coats. I sat in offices and looked at paper. I examined signatures, ink composition, paper grain, date stamps, photocopier artifacts. I was trained to find the thing that was wrong in something that was meant to look right. It was a particular way of seeing, and once you develop it, you cannot turn it off. You carry it home. You carry it to the grocery store. You carry it to your own kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in March. I looked at the woman sitting across from me and I began, very quietly, to look for the thing that was wrong. Her name, she had told me when we met at a conference in Toronto 24 years ago, was Sandra Patricia Whitmore. She grew up in Sudbury. Her father had worked at the Inco smelter for 30 years. Her mother had taught elementary school. She had one older brother named Dennis, who lived in Thunder Bay and called on holidays but rarely visited. She was allergic to pine nuts, not severely, just enough to make her cautious at Thai restaurants. She had a small scar near her left collarbone from a bicycle accident when she was 9 years old. She could not whistle. She had tried, over the years, whenever someone brought it up, and she could not make the sound. The woman across the table from me folded the newspaper and set it down. I said casually, the way you say anything at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, "I was thinking about calling Dennis this week. His birthday is coming up, isn't it?" She looked at me over her tea. "Dennis's birthday is in September," she said. "You know that." "Right," I said. "I got confused with your cousin Paul." She nodded and reached for the newspaper again. Dennis's birthday was in February. It had passed 3 weeks ago. We had sent a card. I looked down at my phone. I need to explain something about how I am built, because it matters to what happened next. I am 63 years old. I grew up in a household where my father, a quiet man who worked for Canada Post for decades, used to say, "Measure twice, cut once." It was his philosophy for everything, not just carpentry. He applied it to arguments, to purchases, to the way he read contracts before signing them. I inherited that patience. My colleagues at the firm used to joke that I was the only person who could spend 4 hours staring at a single page and walk away looking satisfied. So I did not panic. I excused myself from the table. I said I needed to make a call about a plumbing estimate. We had been having some trouble with the pipe under the guest bathroom, which was true. I went upstairs to my home office, and I closed the door, and I sat very still for approximately 4 minutes. Then I called Roy. He picked up on the second ring. "Tell me exactly what you saw," I said. He told me. He had been in the lobby of the Chateau Laurier for a meeting with his nephew, who worked in event planning, and had arranged to use one of the hotel's meeting rooms. Roy had arrived early. He was sitting in one of the lobby chairs near the concierge desk, reading something on his tablet, when the front doors opened and a couple walked through. The woman was wearing a gray wool coat with a mandarin collar. She had Sandra's hair, that particular shade of dark brown with the gray coming in at the temples, cut to the jaw. She had Sandra's height and Sandra's way of walking, slightly forward-leaning, like she was always about to say something important. The man with her was perhaps 50, well-dressed, carrying a leather overnight bag. He had his hand at the small of her back. They went directly to the front desk. Roy had taken the photo from his chair, at an angle. He had then, because Roy was Roy, walked slowly past the front desk on his way to the washroom, and listened long enough to hear the name given at check-in. "What name?" I said. "Sandra Whitmore," he said. She gave her own name. I sat with that for a moment. "And the room?" I said. "2 nights," he said. I heard that much. After I hung up, I sat in my office chair and looked at the wall where I keep a framed copy of the official seal from my first major case, a land title forgery in 1997 that had taken me 8 months to untangle. I had framed it not out of pride, but as a reminder that complicated things have structures underneath them, and if you look long enough and carefully enough, the structure reveals itself. I had a woman downstairs who called herself my wife, and knew my wife's birthday, but not her brother's birthday. I had my actual wife at a hotel 4 blocks from Parliament Hill, with a man I did not know. I had 22 years of marriage, and 31 years of professional experience in detecting deception. I put on my reading glasses, and I went back downstairs. The next 72 hours were the strangest of my life. I want to be careful about how I describe what it is like to live alongside someone you know is not who they claim to be. People who have not done it imagine it must feel like a horror film. It did not feel that way. It felt like work. It felt like being back at the office with a document in front of me that was almost right, but not quite right, and knowing that my job was to catalog every discrepancy without disturbing the surface. I made a list in a small notebook I kept locked in the drawer of my desk. Old habit. The first entry was the birthday. Dennis, February, not September. The second entry came that evening, when we were making dinner together. Sandra, my actual Sandra, had a particular way of chopping vegetables. She held the knife with her index finger, extended along the spine of the blade. She had learned it from a cooking class she took in 2009. She had shown me at the time, and I had tried to copy it, and failed. The woman in my kitchen held the knife in a standard closed grip. The third entry was about the scar. We were watching television after dinner. She was wearing a V-neck sweater. I looked at her collarbone. The scar, that small, smooth ridge from the bicycle accident, was not there. I wrote it in the notebook and underlined it twice. The fourth entry came the next morning, when I left a small test. I placed a jar of pesto on the counter, one Sandra kept for pasta nights. The label listed pine nuts in the ingredients. My actual wife would have moved it to the back of the cupboard. She always did. An old reflex. The woman left it on the counter all day and used some of it on toast at lunch. By the end of the second day, I had 11 entries. I had also, in the meantime, done other things. I had contacted a private investigator, a woman named Carol Fitzpatrick, who I knew through a mutual contact at the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. I had given her Roy's photo and the hotel information. Within 18 hours, she had confirmed that Sandra Whitmore and a man named Gerald Oakes, a commercial real estate developer from Vancouver, had checked into the Chateau Laurier and were still there. Carol sent me 2 additional photographs, taken from the hotel bar. In one of them, Sandra was laughing at something Oakes was saying. It was not a polite laugh. It was the laugh of someone who was fully present, fully at ease, fully somewhere she wanted to be. I had also made a quiet inquiry with our bank. I will not detail exactly how I obtained what I obtained. Some professional relationships from the old days remain useful. But what I found was this. Over the previous 14 months, a series of transfers had been made from our joint savings account in amounts that stayed just below the threshold that would have triggered an automatic review. Transfers to an account I did not recognize, totaling, by my calculation, a little over $68,000. I sat in my office on the second night, and I looked at that number for a long time. I thought about the renovation she had suggested last spring, the kitchen renovation we had decided against because it seemed too expensive for a house we might eventually downsize out of. I thought about the financial planner's appointment she had canceled twice in a row without rescheduling. I I thought about the new password on her laptop, which I had noticed but not mentioned because I believed, at the time, that people were entitled to privacy even in long marriages. I wrote the number in my notebook. Then I wrote, beside it, measure twice. On the third morning, I did something I had been thinking about since the first phone call from Roy. I made breakfast. Scrambled eggs and toast, orange juice, the way we always did on weekday mornings when neither of us had anywhere urgent to be. I set the table. I poured the coffee. And when she came downstairs and sat across from me, I said, as if I had just remembered something, "Whatever happened to that old friend of yours from the Sudbury days, the one you used to mention, the one whose mother ran the craft shop on Elm?" She looked at me with a small smile. "Which one do you mean?" There were a few. "The one you went to Algonquin Park with, the summer before you moved to Toronto. You told me that story once about the canoe tipping." A pause. Brief, but real. "Oh," she said. "Yes. We lost touch years ago. The story about the canoe, Sandra had told me that story on our third date, at a restaurant on Bloor Street, and she had told it with so much detail that I still remembered the name of the girl. Paulette. They had lost touch, yes. But Sandra never said we lost touch. She always said, with a particular kind of fond regret, we just drifted, the way people do. It was a phrase she used for any friendship that had faded. I had heard it a dozen times over 2 decades. I nodded and went back to my eggs. That afternoon, I called my son in Vancouver, our eldest, who was 34 and worked in software development. I did not tell him what was happening. I simply asked him if he had spoken to his mother lately, and whether anything had seemed different to him. He said they had spoken on the phone about 10 days ago, and she had seemed a little distracted, a little formal. He had assumed she was tired. I thanked him and told him everything was fine. I went back to my notebook. On the 4th day, Sandra came home. Not the woman in my house. My actual wife. Sandra Patricia Whitmore, 59 years old, who grew up in Sudbury and could not whistle, and had a scar near her left collarbone, and held her knife with her index finger along the spine. She came through the front door in the late afternoon while the woman I had started thinking of her privately as the other one, which I understand is clinical, but it was how my mind organized the situation was upstairs. I heard the key in the lock. I was in the living room. I stood up. She stopped when she saw me. We looked at each other. I said nothing. She set her bag down slowly. She was still wearing the gray wool coat. I said, "How was Ottawa?" Her face changed. Not dramatically. Sandra had always been controlled. It was one of the things I had admired about her, and apparently one of the things I had failed to understand fully. But something shifted around her eyes. A calculation. "Fine," she said. "I told you I was visiting Claire." Claire was her university roommate. Claire lived in Gatineau, and they met for lunch every few months. "Right," I said. "How is Claire?" "She's well. Same as always." I nodded. I said, "There's someone upstairs." The calculation behind her eyes accelerated. "The cleaning woman," she said, without hesitating. "I forgot to mention, I booked her. Our cleaning service sent a young man named Marco, who came every other Thursday. We had used the same service for 6 years." "Of course," I said. I went to the kitchen and put on the kettle, and I listened to her go upstairs. I heard 2 sets of footsteps. I heard a door close. I heard voices, not the words, just the cadence, an urgent, low exchange. The kind of conversation that covers a lot of ground very quickly. I made 2 cups of tea. I carried them to the bottom of the stairs, and I waited. What I know about the arrangement, I pieced together partly from what Sandra eventually told me and partly from what Carol Fitzpatrick confirmed through her own channels. Sandra had met Gerald Oakes at a professional development seminar in Calgary 18 months earlier. Their relationship had moved quickly. By last autumn, they had begun making plans that required Sandra to have uninterrupted time away from home without raising my suspicion. Oakes traveled frequently for work. Sandra wanted to travel with him. The problem was me, not me specifically, but my presence, my habits, my tendency to notice things. The other one's name was Miriam. She was a theater actress based in Montreal, mid-30s, who had done some corporate role-play training work and had, over the years, developed what she described to a friend as a particular talent for sustained character work. She and Sandra had met through a mutual contact, and the arrangement had been made over several months. Miriam had spent time studying Sandra photographs, videos, voice recordings Sandra had provided, notes on mannerisms and habits, and the particular domestic routines of our life together. She was not a twin. She was not a look-alike in any remarkable genetic sense. She was simply a skilled actress who had done a thorough job of preparation, aided by the fact that most people, most husbands, most retired men reading their invoices at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning do not look at their wives the way a forensic document examiner looks at a questioned signature. Most people do not look for the thing that is wrong in something meant to look right. Sandra had paid Miriam approximately $9,000 for the arrangement. She had planned for the 2 hotel stays to be her trial run before a longer trip she and Oakes were planning to the coast of Portugal in the spring. The $68,000 was in an account in her name alone. She had been preparing, methodically and patiently, for an exit. I will not pretend there was a dramatic confrontation. I am 63 years old, and dramatic confrontations belong to people who still believe that volume is a substitute for clarity. What happened was this. Sandra came back downstairs alone. Miriam had left through the back door while I was in the kitchen. I heard it close. Sandra sat down at the kitchen table, and I sat across from her, and I placed the notebook in front of her, open to the first page. She looked at it. She looked at the 11 entries. She looked at the number I had written at the bottom. I said, "I've retained a lawyer. Carol Fitzpatrick has documentation of the hotel stays and Gerald Oakes. The bank will receive a formal inquiry by the end of the week." She was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known?" she said. "Tuesday morning," I said. "Roy called me." She nodded slowly. There was something in her face that I had not expected, not guilt, exactly, but something closer to relief. The relief of a person who has been holding a thing in the wrong position for too long and is finally allowed to put it down. "I wasn't going to take more," she said. "I know," I said, because by then I did know. The transfers had stopped 3 months ago. She had taken what she calculated she needed, and she had stopped. That, too, was part of the methodology. "That doesn't change anything," I said. "No," she said. "I know it doesn't." We sat there in the kitchen, where we had eaten breakfast together for 22 years, and we were very quiet. The radio was still on, low, some afternoon program. Outside the window, the street was the same as it always was, the neighbor's car in the driveway, the bare maple at the edge of the property, the gray March sky over Ottawa pressing down on everything. I thought about the woman who had sat in this chair for 4 days, and made tea, and read the newspaper, and eaten pine nuts, without flinching. I thought about what it meant that I had noticed the knife grip but not. For years, the slow widening of the distance between us, the missed dinners, the canceled appointments, the conversations that had become shorter and more careful, the way a long marriage can erode so gradually that you look up one Tuesday morning and find that the woman across from you is a stranger, and the stranger is a woman you know. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. The $68,000 was addressed in the settlement. I kept the house. Our son took it hard at first, the way adult children always do when they discover that their parents were capable of surprising them. He came to visit in the fall, and we spent a week hiking in Gatineau Park, and by the end of it he was, if not fully reconciled to things, at least beginning to understand that life does not always fail along the lines we expect. Miriam, the actress, was not charged. I had considered it. Carol had prepared a file. But in the end, after a long conversation with my lawyer and a longer conversation with myself in the early morning quiet of my office, I decided that the harm done to me by Miriam was less than the harm that a legal process would continue to do to me. She had done what she was paid to do. She had been, in her way, a professional. I understood something about that. Sandra and Gerald Oakes did travel to Portugal eventually. Whether that is a happy ending for her or not is not a question I spend much time on. She made her choices with full knowledge of what they were. So did I, in deciding not to pursue her through the courts beyond the financial matters. We were both, by the end, simply people who had arrived at the edge of something and looked down. Roy came for dinner in November, the first time I had cooked properly for a guest since everything had happened. He brought a bottle of Ontario Red, and we ate at the kitchen table, and he asked, eventually, the way old friends ask things they have been holding, "How did you know?" Right away, I mean. From that first morning, I thought about it. "The birthday," I said. "She got the month wrong." He shook his head slowly. 22 years, and she didn't know the brother's birthday. "She had done her homework," I said. She had done a remarkable amount of homework, but homework has limits. You can study a person. You cannot become them. He poured more wine. And the rest? He said. The knife, the scar, all of it? The rest confirmed what I already knew, I said. The first thing just told me to look. There is something I have been thinking about since all of this happened, and I want to say it because I think it matters. We talk about deception as though it always arrives from outside, as though the threat to a life you have built always comes from somewhere foreign and obvious. But the more significant deceptions, in my experience, are the ones that grow slowly inside the ordinary. They grow in the gap between what we look at and what we actually see. They grow in the years we spend comfortable in assumption, certain we know the people beside us because we have stood beside them long enough. I spent 31 years finding forgeries. I was good at it, and I still sat across from a stranger for 4 days before I understood what had been happening in my own house for much longer than 4 days. That is not a comfortable thing to say about yourself. But I think it is true, and I think it is worth saying. The lesson I carried out of that kitchen is not a dramatic one. It is the same lesson I learned the first time I held a questioned document under oblique light and saw, in the paper grain, the ghost of something that had been erased and written over. The lesson is this. The most important details are almost always the ones you have been looking at so long you stopped seeing them. The habit of a familiar face is one of the strongest habits the human mind builds. We fill in the gaps. We complete the picture from memory. We see what we expect to see because it is easier, and because love, even a love that has been thinning for years, still wants to believe in its own continuity. Pay attention. Not in a suspicious way, not in the way of a person who cannot trust, but in the way of someone who has decided that the people in their life deserve to be seen clearly, honestly, and often. Ask questions, not because you fear the answers, but because genuine knowledge of another person requires the willingness to keep asking after you think you already know. And if something is wrong, if there is a detail that does not match, a month misremembered, a scar that should be there, and isn't, trust the part of yourself that noticed. That part of you is trying to help. I still sit at the kitchen table in the mornings. The house is quieter now, which took some getting used to. I still make 2 cups of tea sometimes, by reflex, and then set one aside. The maple at the edge of the property put out leaves again in May, the way it always does. The CBC morning program is still on the radio. The invoices still come. I still notice things. That part of me, at least, I would not change.